All right, everybody, welcome back. So this is the second part of your Unit 2 review in prep for the test this week. So where we left off prior to the break was looking at the Chapter 6 material. So we talked about intelligence and memory. What I'd like to do now is have a brief review of the Chapter 4 material that will be covered on the test. And again, it's just these pages 64 to 69 of Chapter 4 on substances and drugs and how they impact our behavior. And then we'll also look at Chapter 7 on emotion and motivation. Quickly though, I wanted to make a quick correction from the first part of the review. I accidentally misspoke and said that the test is on Friday. The test is not on Friday. It is on Wednesday, the 6th. So just make sure that you note that. That was just a small accident that I made in the first review. All right, so let's look at the Chapter 4 material here. So the main things to focus on for the Chapter 4 material on drugs and different substances and substance abuse is, of course, the definitions, key terms, the different substance categories. I did a lot of kind of external descriptions and talked a little bit more about how these different substances affect our bodies and how the addiction to these different substances work and the different neurochemicals that they're associated with. You don't need to know about that for the test. Just focus on the material that's on the PowerPoint and the key terms that are discussed in your textbook. So of course, focusing on that definition of substance abuse, the key term or the key word here is really harm, that this is the use and abuse of a substance that leads to some sort of harm for an individual and or other people in that person's life. We looked at a few key terms. So we talked about dependence, when a person, of course, develops that strong compulsion to keep using a substance, and it could be a physical dependence or psychological dependence. So make sure that you review those terms. We talked about the concept of tolerance, that this is when a person needs to continue taking more and more of a substance to achieve the same effect. And then we also talked about the concept of withdrawal, which goes hand in hand with the concept of dependence. When a person goes into a state of withdrawal, they have developed a dependence on a particular substance, and their body can't function without that particular drug in their system. All right, so we looked at the withdrawal timelines of a couple different substances. You don't need to worry about that for the test. Just make sure that you know what the concept of withdrawal means. All right, so looking at the substance categories, we looked at these 4 categories here. So for the test, just make sure that you can describe each of these 4 categories and give me some examples of the different substances that would be considered part of those categories. So a test question might ask you, which of the following types of substances provides powerful pain relief and feelings of euphoria? Well, that would, of course, be an opiate. Or it might ask you something like, which of the following drug categories is heroin a part of? Well, that would, of course, be an opiate, for example. So we looked at the opiates. We talked about the depressants, which are substances that slow down our central nervous system activity. Main example would be alcohol. We also talked about the stimulants, which do the opposite of depressants. Instead of slow things down, they speed things up or stimulate our central nervous system activity. And the main examples that we talked about were things like cocaine and nicotine, amphetamines, and methamphetamines. And then we also talked about the hallucinogens. We focused a bit more on marijuana, just with the legalization process that's happening in our country right now. We talked a little bit about some of the associated issues there. So that's a quick run through of the Chapter 4 material on substances and addictions. What I'd like to do next is look at, if I can find it, there it is, the material on Chapter 7, which is emotion and motivation. All right, so let's get right back to the beginning here. Okay, so again, for the test, definitions, key terms, things like that. This test isn't going to go into quite as much detail. It's you've got 50 minutes and 45 questions. So let's start things off with our definition of an emotion. Make sure that you're familiar with this definition, and in particular, the three components of our emotions. That when we have an emotion, it is a physiological experience. There's usually a behavioral expression associated with that emotion, and there's also something cognitive happening when we have that emotion. It's usually attached to a thought process, for example. We looked at the universality hypothesis, which basically says that, even though there are certain parts of our culture that impact the way that we express emotions, these 6 emotions here seem to be quite universal in nature, and they have these different facial expressions attached to them. So just know what the universality hypothesis is and the 6 emotions that are attached to them. In class, we talked about Plutchik's emotion wheel theory. This will not be on the test. It was just more for information and understanding about how some emotions are considered a little simpler and some emotions are considered a bit more complex, but that won't be on the test. We also looked at how our emotions work with our nervous system, in particular the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches of our autonomic nervous system. So some nice review from unit number 1. The sympathetic part of our autonomic nervous system is, of course, associated with that fight or flight response, which would be a very severe fear response that a person is having. And then the parasympathetic branch would work together with the sympathetic branch to help keep the body in as much of a state of balance as possible. And this is the part of the autonomic nervous system that restores the body to a sense of calm. We talked a little bit about lying and stress and the different physiological changes that happen for many of us when we experience stress, such as telling a lie. So we talked about how polygraph or lie detector machines work. All right, so let's switch gears a little bit and talk about motivation. So we started off with that definition of motivation, the force behind human behavior that explains why we do what we do. We talked about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. So just make sure that you're familiar with these 2 concepts, and what I might do is give an example and ask you to identify what type of motivation is occurring in that example. What we spent most of our time focusing on was Maslow's hierarchy of needs model of motivation, which talks about how all kinds of human behaviors are motivated. Some are physiologically motivated, right? We have to take care of our physiological needs. Some of the needs that we have are to belong, be in relationships, have friendships. Some of the needs are more higher order, like the need for esteem, for intellectual achievements, etc. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs looks like this, of course, and his idea was that before you could go on to satisfy higher level needs like esteem and love and belonging, that you would, of course, have to take care of your lower level needs, like your physiological needs and your safety needs, before you could tackle some of these higher order needs that you might have as well. So let's start with physiological, right? That Maslow thought that we needed to or that we had to take care of our physiological needs first, that these needs would always trump higher order needs, that we would always have to make sure that, we had gotten something to eat and we weren't thirsty and, we were well rested and etc. And then after our physiological needs were met, Maslow argued that we could then go on to satisfy our safety needs, things like, our actual physical safety, that sort of thing. Then he said that once our safety and physiological needs were met, that we could go on to satisfy our needs for love and belonging, like having friends and, good relationships with our family. After these three needs were met, Maslow said that we could go on to satisfy our esteem needs, things like confidence and achievement and feeling respected. And then, once all these four needs were met, Maslow argued that only then we could go on to have experiences of self-actualization. Now, this was the term that he used to talk about what it felt like when we reached our full potential. And he said that we would experience that through what he called, peak experiences. That was the term that he used for when a person felt as though they had met their full potential. But that of course, would be temporary. We would never really reach a full state of ever meeting our full potential because, of course, at some point you're going to need to eat again and you're going to need to go to bed and you're going to have to go to the bathroom, etc. So Maslow argued that we kind of go up and down this thing a few times a day, depending on what need was most important. And of course, if a physiological or safety need occurred, we would have to take care of that before we could go on to satisfy these higher order needs. Really interesting theory of motivation. Your textbook goes into a few other theories of motivation, things like drive reduction theory, etc. So make sure that you spend some time reviewing that material from the textbook because we just didn't have time in class to go through everything. All right. We spent a bit of extra time chatting about the need for love and belonging and the type of needs that are satisfied by healthy, positive professional experiences, that it gives a sense of meaning and that kind of thing. So again, just make sure that you're very familiar with this particular theory. It will be focused on the test. And what I might do is give an example of something and say, okay, which of the following needs, according to Maslow's theory, is this person attempting to satisfy at this particular moment? So you would have to pick out which of these ones they were working on at that given moment. All right, so let's just have a quick refresher again. Section 1, I see you guys on Wednesday at 8 a.m. So you're going to write your test on Wednesday at 8 a.m. And then Section 2, I see you guys at 2 p.m. in D1060. So you'll write your test at 2 p.m. Everybody is going to write on Wednesday, December the 6th, though. So that's the date of the test. And the test will again be 45 multiple choice questions on Unit 2 material only. You'll have the full 50 minutes to write the test. You probably won't need it, but it's there for you if you would like to take the full 50 minutes. And this one is really important. I just want to highlight that. Make sure that you bring 2 well-sharpened pencils and a good eraser, just to make sure that you have everything that you need to write the test. It's always better to write these tests with pencil so that you can, of course, go back and, make a change if you have to. And then Section 2, in Friday's class, we're going to start our third unit, starting with social psychology. And then Section 1, I see you guys right after your test at 9 a.m. for the second half of your class. And so we're just going to jump right into Unit 3 after you finish writing your test on Wednesday morning. All right, folks, I'm around by email if anybody does have a question. My email address is, of course, right here. So feel free to send me a message if you do have any questions or concerns about the test. Otherwise, I hope this was helpful, and I will see you on Wednesday for your second test. Cheers!